Awara, Okolaki, agus Aini Osol. But while I'm felt a rally, a riv and show, go UCD and the lake, and you know, it's a egg, yes. It is a real honour and a pleasure to welcome you to University College Dublin for the annual lecture with the Tinnell, particularly after so many years of being away, and the last time I was standing here before this esteemed crowd, we were in a hotel down the road, so you're definitely welcome back. On behalf of my esteemed colleagues in Celtic Studies here in the School of Irish Celtic Studies and Folklore, I'm particularly Dr. Roisin McLaughlin, Dr. Franjay Shi, and our newest member to join us, Dr. Jacqueline Bemer. We welcome you to this first corporal meeting for some time here in Belfield. And it is a real honour to have the speaker that we have here this evening. Around 20 years ago was the first time I heard of Professor Máire Ní Mhaonaigh's name, and it was as if she was magical. Who is now a colleague was speaking, that Maura had looked at her monograph and had sorted her out, and she was really relieved. And I said, that is someone we definitely need in this world, and it is true. She has given so much to medieval Irish landscape, her work on language, literature, and history, in particular her work on Vikings, the interface between the Scandinavian, Nordic, and Gaelic cultures, philology, medieval Welsh language and literature, and so much more in terms of everything. And here tonight, her work with medieval manuscripts. At the moment, one of her main funding projects is the Mapping the Medieval Mind, Ireland's literary landscape in a global space, and some recent publications, in case you haven't been able to keep up with her. There's a very fine volume that came out earlier this year. Her article, Technology, Writing and Place in Medieval Irish Literature in Technology in Irish Literature and Culture, edited by Margaret Kelleher and James O'Sullivan, came out earlier this year from Cambridge University Press. And as well as that, this year she has medieval glossaries and multilingual context in medieval glossaries from Northwestern Europe, tradition and innovation. And we see that in the Medieval Translator, Volume 19. And the list goes on. And so it is an absolute honour and a pleasure to have Professor Máire Ní Mhaonaigh deliver tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you and your colleagues for that generous introduction, and indeed for hosting the lecture here tonight. And I'm also, it's an enormous honour for me to be here presenting the statutory lecture for 2023, and I'm very grateful to the director at the Institute and his colleagues for inviting me. I should also say that it's wonderful now that we've actually got in to be in UCD, because I can't think of a more appropriate place to give this kind of lecture than in Mag Mel, because as you'll see, there are quite a number of Mag. There's many a Mag, as it were, in the dindshenchas material that we're going to look at this evening. So the whole landscape and manuscript. For John Montague, from whose collection of poetry, The Rough Field, the quote in the title of this lecture is taken, landscape embodied and communicated history. No rock or ruin, dún or dolmen, but showed memory-defying cruelty through an image-encrusted name. And the image-encrusted name at the heart of this work is Garavacha, a rugged expanse of pasture, the rough field of the title in Montague's childhood home from the time he was about 4 years old, namely Garvaghey, County Tyrone. And in this, for him, deliberate evocation of dindshenchas, named features in the landscape relate a story of resistance, his memory-defying cruelty. Or to paraphrase Christopher Schliephake from a different context, and one indeed to which I will return, terrain has been rendered into text. Transforming places into parchment, so the whole landscape, a manuscript, is of course the essence of dindshenchas as broadly defined. As a general literary category, landscape lore, the dindshenchas or knowledge expressed through a prominent place or din, and indeed as a specific textual creation, Dindsenchas Éireann, the story of Ireland's notable places, a compilation preserved in manuscripts of the 14th and 15th centuries and later. So in both of these interrelated senses, Dindsenchas articulates a cultural meaning of space. And image-encrusted names are the primary mode of expression, the symbolic substance of the landscape being conveyed creatively in the essence, in the elements as well, indeed, of a name. So in this way, of course, Dindsenchas encapsulates a meaning of reading the environment, enunciating how landscape was shaped and storied, embodying interactive engagement between humans and the natural world, the natural features around them. This reading is, of course, time sensitive. Dindsenchas narratives denote culturally determined meaning. They embody, they give voice to the perception of the physical world, the environmental imagination relating to a given period and place. Meanings may have become layered and indeed entangled as part of the accretive process which gave rise to Dindsenchas Éireann, some other manuscript versions of which you see here, including the newest addition to the wonderful Irish Scripts on Screen website, REN 598. So through then the various kind of manuscript versions of this, as I say, meanings have become entangled. So reading the environment through that multi-text corpus involves attention to the overarching landscape of which its interconnected stories form part. So what I want to do this evening then is to discuss ways of reading that environment with the interrelated narratives of Dindsenchas Éireann to the fore. So my focus is going to be on the macro text as a whole, as a created work of environmental literary history, rather than on specific components of it. And these thoughts have been informed by my work on the ongoing Dindsenchas project that Kelly kindly mentioned, namely mapping the medieval mind, and in particular by regular discussion with the two researchers on that project, my colleagues Dr. David McKay and Dr. Marie-Louise Teuerkauf. And their transcription of Dindsenchas Éireann from a number of key manuscripts, including the Book of Ivanne, and the image of that was on the poster illustrating the lecture, and the Book of Ballymote, which you can see here on the right here. They've transcribed from those manuscripts and indeed from others, and that of course provides the fundamental textual foundations for the research. I'm going to address aspects of reading the environment in Dindsenchas narratives in terms of order, symbolism, and what we can glean, if anything, about the actual environment in turn. And these themes are embodied in the famous sycamore gap tree at Hadrian's Wall, a living tree which provided a point of orientation in the landscape as part of Hadrian's Wall, while also being of great symbolic significance, as indeed was seen in the coverage of its felling in an act of vandalism about 7 weeks ago. And as will be seen, tonight trees will actually form a running theme, not least because of their significance within the political and legal framework of early Ireland. This material is not my focus, but it does provide important context for my comments on trees and woodland more generally as they appear in Dindsenchas Éireann. So in reading the environment in that corpus, prefatory material provided in some manuscript copies provide a guide, placing its composition, as many of you know, at a specific time and place. That's at an assembly hosted by the 6th century king of Tara, Diarmuid mac Cearrafáil, and with ecclesiastical and learned participation in the form of a successor of St Patrick, namely Flann Fevle, Bishop of Armagh, and a significant sage of the men of Ireland, Ken Voiled. And the account of the authoritative history of Ireland's notable places, so the Dindshenchas Fide Din that follows, is associated with an antediluvian figure of extraordinary longevity, Fintan Mach Bochra, according it legitimacy. So this narrative frame then situates the topography of Ireland within an established pseudo-historical scheme, beginning with one of the early settlers of Ireland, Kesser, granddaughter of Noah. A pivotal figure in another overarching history of Ireland, Lever Gavála Éideann, structured around peoples rather than place. The Kesser connection, as well as other parallel passages between these two grand macro narratives, as it were, so Dindsenchas Éideann and Lever Gavála, they underline their common intellectual approach, forming dual strands in an historiographical enterprise. The story of Ireland recounted in Dindsenchas Éideann is ordered around place. And that ordering, of course, involved naming. Describing physical features of the landscape involved assigning names to them, and thus explanation at the most fundamental level. In this, medieval Irish scholars were heavily influenced, as is well known, by Isidore of Seville, for whom understanding something's force or nature meant comprehending the origin and the meaning of its name. For if you see where the name comes from, you will understand its force, its nature faster, as he put it himself. Dindsenchas narratives fix characters and events in landscape, memorializing them through the onomastic elements of a specific place. The name can signify a relationship between human and non-human agents, as in the well-known example here of the Boyne, a disfigured, drowning woman transformed into a river as she heads to the sea in shame. In this and other examples, in the process of naming, out of undefined space, culturally significant place is formed. So etymologizing encapsulates links between people and their surroundings, natural cultural interactions embedded in that image-encrusted name. Tracing the trajectories of such interactions between nature and culture is the scholarly focus of what has come to be known as material eco-criticism or eco-materialism. A study of the way material forms, including landscapes, interact with each other and with the human dimension, producing configurations of meanings and discourses that we can interpret as stories. That's one definition that you have there in front of you of this emerging field. And in its emphasis on the integral ways of thinking language and reality, bringing those two together, and indeed meaning and matter in various ways, it provides a lens through which to read the historical environment and indeed interpret literary representations of what's sometimes been termed the natural cultural dynamics of a past material world. Building on an understanding of ecology that views human actions as but one strand within a kind of a complex web of interrelationships involving other entities, it challenges a primarily anthropocentric outlook. And while, of course, contemporary concerns should not colour our reading of pre-modern texts, stories of the past eloquently articulate where and how humans and their natural surroundings interact in historical times. Such nodes have been illuminated in some pre-modern disciplines through the perspective of storied ecology, and that's an approach concerned with how earlier authors, and here I quote Christopher Schliephake again, how earlier authors perceived, made sense of, or even protected their surroundings, negotiating ecological insight and wisdom in and through stories, end of quote. Read within the context of the cultural and socio-political dynamics at the time of their composition and transmission, literary narratives illuminate aspects of their environment, not least in their imaginative depiction of encounters among humans and animals and between living creatures and the natural world. So stories, in effect, they give meaning to changing surroundings, expanding the nexus of connections, embedding humans in the ecosphere. They're conduits for transferring important forms of knowledge, as Fintan Mac Bóchra's revelation of a narrativized landscape of Ireland in the context of Dindsenchas writing makes clear. In this way, and indeed in others, analysis of narratives in Dindsenchas Éideann has much to offer this scholarly approach. Fintan's role, so Fintan Mac Bóchra's role as transmitter of knowledge concerning Ireland's significant places is resonant of another narrative, De Hidegud Telig Tevra, the establishment of the Dominion of Tara, on which the account in Dindsenchas Éideann is most likely drawn, as John Carey discussed in this very university in his recent Bergen Memorial Lecture, indeed the online version of which I heartily recommend. Supplementary detail provided in this, in De Hidegud, in the earlier text, includes how Fintan's expertise was augmented and interpreted by a figure of extraordinary proportions, namely Tre Illingid Tre Achar, who would come to Ireland on the day of the crucifixion, and basically Fintan described him as either that he was an angel of God, or indeed he was God himself. As a symbol of this kind of sanctioned wisdom, Tre Illingid bestowed upon Fintan berries from a golden, multicoloured branch of Lebanese wood, from which Fintan then derived sustenance. We may note in passing that this echoes the biblical trees, but specifically the exegetical interpretation of the book of Genesis by the 4th or 5th century theologian Augustine of Hippo, who argued that the tree of knowledge from which Eve ate the forbidden fruit was not in itself evil, since all trees are God's creations, and hence they were inherently good and intended for food. Sorry, it was the first time I mentioned the Bible, and I'm very happy to continue like this, except I'm not so sure how long I'm going to be able to see my notes.
We're just so enamored, we're not moving.
Anyhow, so this is all about berries from this kind of golden bough and all the rest of it. But anyhow, the berries Fintan was given provided him with sustenance for both body and mind, and from these grew Ireland's 5 famous trees, whose longevity, I should say, as many of you know, is linked with that of Fintan himself. So the opening of Dindsenchas Éideann authorises its history with reference to Fintan, the implication being, as it were, that he himself is the poet who recounts the material concerning the most significant of places in the Dindsenchas, namely Tara, with which the corpus begins. Fintan's importance at this moment of knowledge revelation has been acknowledged, but his figure, I think, is also resonant at various other junctures throughout Dindsenchas Éideann. It's significant, for example, that some versions of Dindsenchas Éideann end with a metrical account of the fall of one of the 5 trees of Ireland, one of the trees that's equivalent with Fintan in age, and that's namely the tree of Tortu, Bille Tortan. In this poem, as I say, with which a number of versions of many versions of the Dindsenchas end, the tree in question is referred to as one of the 3 landmarks of Ireland, and the other 2 are referred to specifically as the trees of Ross and of Mhaonaigh. Grief on account of the demise of this tree of Tortu is led by a series of saints. You have the names of some of them here in front of you. They include Alton of Techtua and indeed Mochoa of Clon Bolcoin. Its lifespan, the lifespan of this particular tree, is said to have extended from the coming of the sons of Meal, so the first of the Gael, to the time of the sons of Oidh Sláine. Oidh, progenitor of one of the 2 main branches of the southern Inail, died in 604. He was a son of Diarmid mac Cerbhail and indeed his successor as king of Tara, and 2 of Oidh's own sons, namely Blathfach and Diarmid, also held the kingship of Tara. And since it was during the time of the first Diarmid mac Cerbhail, you'll remember that an aged Fintan is said to have given forth his dindshenchas, then the loss of one of Ireland's famous trees some decades later, allegedly, accords then with the kind of alleged coevality, as it were, of sage and sap. So in opening with Fintan's authoritative account and closing then with the fall of one of his arboreal equivalents, then Dindsenchas Éireann acquires a structure that is deliberately cyclical. And as God, in the form of Tre Illingud, directed Fintan's Dindsenchas, the creator of the tree of Tortu is also presented as the one who oversaw its demise. The king who created its form, as you have there in front of you, has brought it low again, as St. Columcille is made to proclaim in the Bille Tortan poem. That the closing poem on the tree of Tortu would have brought the opening account of Fintan to mind is supported by the direct connection, or the direct association perhaps drawn between the antediluvian authority and this and other famous trees where they appear elsewhere in the corpus and indeed throughout this corpus. So, for example, a prosimetric narrative on Tever Luachra, which forms part of the body of Dindsenchas Éireann, records the precise genesis of Bille Tortan and its counterpart, the tree of Ross, both of which we're told were revealed on the night of the birth of Con Ciad Catach. This auspicious event, as you see from the text in front of you, was simultaneously marked by the rising of 3 rivers, namely the Suir, the Nore and the Barrow, and the formation through inundation of 2 lakes, including Loch Lane near Killarney, close of course to Tever Luachra, around which place this Dindsenchas narrative revolves. Named after Tia, wife of Éireann, one of the sons of Meal, through Tia, this particular Tever is linked with another Tever of greater importance, namely the central Tever on the plain of Brecha, and as the text tells us there, and with every other Tever that exists in Ireland. The narrative's poem is attributed to none other than Fintan mac Bóchra, as the metrical composition one of the metrical compositions associated with the central Tara with which Dindsenchas Éireann opens is also put into Fintan's mouth. And it's Fintan's mentor and berry bestower, namely Tre Illingud, who is associated with another of Ireland's famous trees, that of Mhaonaigh, an account of which again is provided at an earlier point in Dindsenchas Éireann. The fruits from the branch that Tre Illingud is depicted as giving to Fintan in the Hidigad Telig Tevra, specifically acorns, apples and nuts, they also feature in the story of Máire Ní Mhaonaigh, that's the plain bearing the tree's name. Again, it's accorded the same length of life as the tree of Tortu, having been hidden until the time of Conn of the 100 Battles, and indeed then falling at the same time as Bille Tortan when Éad Sláine's sons ruled. An alternative account of its demise is alluded to in an additional poem which is preserved in one copy of Dindsenchas Éideann in a 16th century manuscript. A reference to the tree having fallen at the hands, or perhaps by the order of the poets, brings an altercation between an 8th century king of Tara, Bovnal Mithe, and a poet, Nanine Aegis, to mind. And whatever the specific situation underlying this allusion, it doesn't form part of other copies of Dindsenchas Éideann, in which the tree of Mhaonaigh, in all of those other copies, it resembles the biblical tree of life with its abundant virtues and trio of fruits. In the various stories then about them across the Dindsenchas corpus, these 5 famous trees represent continuity. And in their extraordinary existence, enmeshed with Fintan mac Bóchra, they demarcate history, their longevity being used to structure swathes of time. Thus, the recurring references to Fintan and the trees associated with him across Dindsenchas Éideann serves to structure Shenchas, or indeed Dindsenchas, of course, in this instance, while underlining repeatedly the authority of the account as a whole. After all, of course, according to an 11th century text on the 4 cardinal points of the world, Fintan provides verbal testimony to the events across 5,550 years that he is said to have lived, while the trees then serve as kind of supporting silent witnesses across the same extended era. Moreover, the knowledge so acquired is exclusive, and special circumstances are required all the time to access it. Averjan mac Avalgada, for example, poet to King Diarmid mac Ceraval, had to fast against Fintan to compel him to give forth his Shenchas, according to the preface to Dindsenchas Éideann. And the same motif is echoed later in the corpus in the Dindsenchas of Tever Luachra, Fintan himself noting that at the coming of the flood, my life faded, and he tells us, as you have there in front of you, he tells us that he retreated to Dún Tolca in Luachar in the southwest of Ireland. And this is an oblique reference to the story of the muteness caused by the roar of the biblical flood, as recounted in an earlier narrative, or in the Fíndian, which depicts him on the crest of a wave, or perhaps in a place, namely Tull Tinne in the southwest of Ireland, until the power of speech, we're told in this text, was miraculously returned to him on the night of Conn Ciad Cahach's birth. And it was on the selfsame night, as you know now, that the trees of Tortu and indeed of Ross emerged quite literally from the shadows, as many Dindsenchas narratives relate. Trees are like people, to quote in translation the 1st century Roman philosopher Seneca, a parallelism reflected in the Dindsenchas through the depiction of Fintan as the coterminous counterpart of Ireland's notable trees, the longer-than-life figure that can give voice to the concepts, or to the expanse, I should say, of human history that their branches symbolically span. And as Fintan bridges and indeed binds pre-Christian and Christian, my age and my era have changed, he tells us in one particular text, that's the poem on Tever Luachra, So as I say, as his age and his era changes, then so too do Ireland's famous trees stand for continuity while marking the different ages, including Christian time. In Christianity, of course, continuity is extended through the promise of eternal life. The poetic dialogue on the fall of the tree of Tortu, with which Dindsenchas ends in very many manuscripts, explores this theme, noting that on account of Adam's transgression, all men must die, being but ruddy earth and lifeless or indeed unfertile clay. And in this trait, they're deemed universal. To all things comes decay, even to human beings comes death. But while one of the speakers in the poem, namely Abbot Thoronon, sees this as final, as symbolised by the withering of this famous tree, another, namely Saint Mahua, is optimistic. He's optimistic that from the roots of this illustrious tree, many a tree might spring, an intimation of hope for humankind. And the scions of human hope in earthly terms in this poem and indeed in related texts are the descendants of Conn of the 100 Battles, Conn Ciad Catach, whose auspicious birth is marked by the reordering of nature, as we've seen, including by the emergence of these propitious trees. These descendants number both Ineil and Connachta, and a specific 5th century king, Alil, son of Nathi, is marked out for special mention in the poem on Billa Thorton. His death, we're told, isn't like that of any other old tree, and the poet laments that the plain of Tortu is a plain without a head, without a ruler, since it lost its noble tree. So the essence of tree and man, the contemporary Conn then and Billa Thorton become one. This text has a political resonance rather than referring to an overall political reference, rather than referring to a specific situation. It proclaims the greatness of the descendants of Conn Ciad Catach, whose Christ-like birth is aligned elsewhere with the beginning of recorded history through Fintan's recovery of the power of speech. It also prompted, as we've seen, the reconfiguration of the landscape. Lakes and rivers emerge along with trees, and so history is related in visual terms, as the Dindsenchas account of Tever Lochra makes clear. In this context, I think it's worth noting that the account of the trees of Ross and Mugna, and indeed of the tree of Tortu, in the final poem of the collection connected with it, they don't propose an integral onomastic connection between the trees in question and the name of the place. Tever Lochra is named from Tea, wife of Eirevon, son of Miel, and it's Fintan and his association with another Tever who provides the link between Locher and the notable trees, as we've seen. Billa Thorton is concerned with the demise of the tree of Tortu, as has been discussed, with only really an implied connection drawn to the plain of Tortu, on which, of course, the tree was believed to have stood. So these marking texts are Dindsenchas texts with a difference, concerned with arboreal monuments in the landscape whose symbolism and significance transcends their name. The account of Mag Mugna commences in more typical Dindsenchas fashion, etymologizing Mugna as the greater or the greatest of things, which is then clarified as Mo Buishkinev, so greater or the greatest of large trees. Or the text continues, it's derived from Mo Gnia, greater than a sister's son, citing indeed Bretha Neved for its explanation of Gnia. And in this way is the tree equated with Christ, whose status as sister's son through the kinship of his mother Mary with the Jews is emphasised throughout medieval literature, including in an Irish context, as many of you will know, in the poems of Blattvok. This then provides a specific link to the story of Tre Illingad's berries and to the progeny of one berry in particular, which remained hidden until the night of Con Ciadchach's birth. The tree's name can only be inferred from the closing formula with which the prose section somewhat arbitrarily ends, from which comes Mag Mugna. Specifically named in the accompanying poem, the tree is associated with a wood rather than with a plain, but its divine Christian connotations are here too underlined. So, Dindsenchas narratives concerning these notable trees thus highlight their enduring symbolism connected with their biblical lifespan, from dormancy to visible growth from the time of the Christ-like Con Ciadchach, as it were, their majestic nature signifying the plane on which they stood, as well as marking the transformation of time. In both these aspects, they resemble the giant sequoias of California's Sierra Nevada, of enormous emblematic importance, but also a barometer for the passing of time in the form, of course, now of climate change. And like these imposing ancient specimens that you see in front of you, many of which I should say date to before the alleged time of Con Ciadchach. So like these, the notable trees of Ireland were of enormous stature. We're told they were 30 cubits in girth. That's about, it's about, a cubit is about one and a half feet. So they're about perhaps 45 feet wide, and they're 300 cubits high. So they soar half as tall again as the average sequoia tree. So these really are truly exceptional trees, particularly because, of course, they represent native species, and they're usually referred to as yew, ash, and oak. The tree of Muchna, for example, is an oak, according to one version of Mag Mugna, and it's said that its top is as broad as its plane. The men of Torthal were told they used to meet under their tree because the pelting of storms couldn't reach them there. While associated with plains, these enormous trees are said to overlook forests, reflecting, of course, the medieval Irish reality of tree growing in groups rather than as individual specimens. The fruit, too, that they're said to give forth, apples, hazelnuts, and acorns, these, of course, were key to the economy of the time. Apples and hazelnuts were the staple plant diet of the population. Acorns were used to fatten pigs. But of course, these trees were no ordinary fruit-producing species. They continuously, we're told, generated the three valuable foodstuffs in turn, again, the symbolism of the Trinity to the fore. But while they're extraordinary, the trees are rooted in the environment of the time. So reading the environment through the trees of Torthal, Mugna, Ross, as presented in Dindsenchas Éireann, highlights their importance in the history constructed in the text as structuring markers of time. From Con Ciadchach to the sons of Oed Sláine, and indeed later, their enormous overarching presence provide roots for an extended pseudo-historical scheme. They, along with Fintan Mac Bóchra, then, as we've seen, they punctuate the narrative, as well as underlining chronological depth and particularly continuity. But as well as ordering events, the stories concerning them symbolise the type of relations between humans and natural features that form the essence of Dindsenchas narratives, epitomising the transformation then of undefined space into culturally significant territory. These trees embody the integral connections expressed in the dindshenchas between people and place. Contemporary resonances can also be articulated in the tales about these trees, as the reference to the Inéal kings revealed, but the actual environment of medieval Ireland can also be read in Dindsenchas Éireann, although in ways not always easy to see. These enormous trees, they're said to provide, as I said, shelter for people, faggots for lighting fires, and both uses are attributed to Bille Thorton, which, with its enormous girth, is said to have overlooked a forest. Its size, we're told, proved dangerous when, as an ageing tree, it was felled by wind, and 150 of the Conala who were attending an assembly under it were killed. But though larger than life and symbolic in character, the features associated with them as trees do reflect daily life. It's in their felling, actually, that trees appear most frequently in Dindsenchas Éireann. Shaping an original landscape meant clearing land for human settlement. The demolition of virgin forests made way for plains, cleared for all kinds of agricultural activity, and very many Dindsenchas Éireann texts refer almost in passing to the obliteration of extensive woodland for the formation of territory suitable for a variety of human uses. And in this pattern of development, the stories also reflect the reality of human existence, as well indeed as the changing rhythms of human engagement with nature in broad terms. Pollen evidence, according to archaeologists, points to a period of forest clearance and agricultural expansion from the 3rd and 4th centuries of our era, leading to a dominance of pasture land and indeed scrub woodland. The influence of Christianity on very many aspects of socio-economic life, including farming practices and technology, have also been studied. To this early medieval period also belongs, of course, the growth of ringfort settlements or raths. These began to decline in the 8th and 9th centuries as grain production was increasing, indicated not least by the large-scale building of mills, which can be dated from this time. The expansion in arable culture, in arable agriculture, which has been posited for this period, may well have influenced the image of the landscape depicted in Dindsenchas Éireann, parts of which have been attributed to 9th and 10th century poets. So in constructing Ireland's past through topographical history, human interaction with nature was to the fore. The interrelated actions then of cutting trees and clearing plains may undoubtedly reflect the reality of an increasing need for arable land. And of the 3 types of territory envisaged throughout Ireland, the first 2, the Mach and the Fith, are very much more to the fore in Dindsenchas Éireann than the bog type. These are set out as the 3 types of land in the Dindsenchas text on Mag Muvach. The act of clearance, of clearing land, is presented as a strenuous one. Tailtu, for whom the plain on which the assembly bearing her name, that's Oinach Tailten, was held, transformed forest into meadowland, into a machara. Cuil Huan, the wooded expanse she hewed down with an axe, is presented as crossing Ireland's breadth, and she died from her exertions, we're told. According to another version of Tailtu's tale, this time embedded in the story of the Dindsenchas of Nos, the wood is said to be cut by others to honour Tailtu, using billhooks, spears and axes. We're told that Tailtu suspected that a trio of workers were actually shirkers. They weren't doing what they were supposed to. She wished then to have them killed, but she was persuaded instead to ask them to build 3 raths. They did, and of course these then bore their names. A rath builder also features in the tale of Loch Dedog, and in this case the man in question actually has a staff rather than a billhook or an axe, and he's clearing roads. Ragnar, he had a more conventional billhook, spade and axe to draw earth and clear a plain of trees near Tours. Avoiding further work there, we're told that he fled to Ireland, to Imloch Mechon, where out of a wooded ridge he made the Mar Ragna that bore his name. Though using the same 3 utensils, namely billhooks, axes and spades, less conventional is the work undertaken by 3 other rath builders, that's Fevan, Ferre and Fa. We're told that they worked in tandem to cultivate the 3 planes that are onomastically associated with them, namely Mag Fevan, Mag Ferre and Mag Fa. And we're told that when Fevan was shoveling, Ferre was hacking and Fa was felling. When Fa was hacking, this is a bit like a tongue twister actually, Ferre was shoveling and Fevan was felling, and each of them would then throw a change of tools to his companion, to the other, across the plain. This shaping of the landscape is scarcely fully realistic, but actually the kind of the collaborative work pattern that's set out is at least logical, because somebody shovels under the tree and then the next person comes and cuts some branches and then the third person comes and actually fells the tree. And also the tools described to enact the process are realistic, not least since they form part of the contemporary archaeological record. And also the act of land reclamation in general is recognisable within the context of land use and development, which can be gleaned from other sources. But the picture presented of a kind of a pristine level territory ready to be planted is, of course, some way from the norm. Mag Mucrava, the plain of pig counting, where Queen Maeve of Connacht is said to have sought control of swine, might be nearer the mark. It had land for tillage, smooth and rough alike, and it's also full of oak woods. It's full of acorn-bearing oaks. The plan delineated for the plain of Macha, that's on the other side of the screen, in which an oak wood stood on its western side, also, of course, makes agricultural sense, with cropland and woodland separate. Indeed, the trees may have been fenced off by an oaken or other fence type, details of which, of course, are delineated in legal texts such as Bretha Covathiasa. The dindshenchas of Strother Macha, this particular one, is actually concerned more with the wondrous fragrance emitted by the mast of the same oak trees, which was perceptible throughout Ireland, we're told, on windy days, causing pigs to go wild in search of it. And this, of course, is absolutely likely to reflect the fact that fattening pigs on such mast when available, usually September and October, was an economic necessity. The story of Maistú here also indicates the importance of such tree fruit. A mast place, it's said to have been a wood in times gone by, the wild spot rich in mast and draughts of mead. The draughts of mead, I think we can assume, were unlikely to have been for the pigs, but there are some references to swineherds in Dindsenchas texts, including indeed in the Dindsenchas text of Odba. The swineherd Odba, we're told, never lived in a house, but in woods, and as well as minding pigs, he also herded stags and does. So these forests are not simply wild spaces to be tamed and cleared for human activity, but they're an important part of a natural ecosystem being controlled by human hands. And in this connection, Oliver Rackham's observations on the pre-modern countryside are pertinent. Specifically, his comment with reference to the medieval English forest being, and I quote, it's being defined as such not by trees, but by the presence of deer to be hunted by the king. The landscape imagined in Dindshenchas Éireann constitutes the accumulation of various layers, literary, social, and historical. An ordered construct, as we have seen, and one imbued with symbolism and allegory, but the impact of people on the actual environment can also be gleaned in the texts, in the tools that they use, for example, in the techniques they apply, also in the almost incidental information that's provided about natural spaces. Dindshenchas Éireann reveals medieval peoples creating their landscape, and the contemporary environment is ever present in the text, as of course it must have been for the authors and indeed the audiences of the Dindshenchas, who were indeed environmentally aware, a concept that's by no means simply modern, as indeed Rackham's work clearly shows. And they were also very, very conscious of the effects humans had on their environment in different ways. Because negative impact also forms part of the Dindsenchas, as in the story of Fornocht, made barren, as the place name barren implies, made barren through the violent actions of Inche and his 21 men. In this case, no flowery plain emerged from the felling of trees and the destruction of the people and their property living there. Instead, the space was made desolate and became forlorn, became fornocht, a bare patch overgrown with grass, where once there had been a bustling settlement with an oaken fort and indeed a great plain with grazing herds and agricultural activities of all kinds. The reason for Inche's violence is not specified in this particular narrative, but the catastrophic results are dramatically presented in what is an address to a personified abandoned place, Fornocht. A wrongdoing has a very, very different effect in one of the very few stories actually in Dindshenchas Éireann centering onomastically on a wood, namely Fidh Ngavla. And of the many explanations, indeed some of them convoluted, of the name, Gavla's wood, one of them actually involves reforestation. Gavla was not paid for previous work undertaken, perhaps actually the felling of trees for clearance, it's implied. So for recompense, he stole a bundle of twigs representative of every tree in Ireland from the daughter of the Dachta. She wished to kind of to form them into the best of buckets, but anyhow, he took the precious bundle of twigs from her, and then he cast it away from him, and a mixed wood, we're told, grew forth in the place that it landed, to which of course Gavla was then entitled, his name on the place then representing his rightful claim to it. By contrast, a crime of fratricide resulted in the emergence of a wood of a different kind on the land on which the crime had been committed. And this is according to the Dindshenchas of Dovtir. It's understood as Dov Tir, black land or gloomy land. It became, we're told, a land of briars, where once it had been brilliant and bright, the landscape became corrupted with stunted growth, responding, as it were, then to the terrible transgression that had been committed on it. According to the Dindshenchas of Lia Nothin, the territorial term Dovtir was absolutely the opposite of Machara, of the meadowland, kind of plain pasture land. Forced to wander through this kind of gloomy Dovtir for 150 years, we're told, Nothin became horrid and hideous. You see some of the quotes there in front of you. Her father went looking for her, and he found her tall, shaggy, in a kind of in this kind of shrouded, gloomy place. Such stories represent medieval Irish ways of making sense of real and hostile environments, distinctions between wild and cultivated being blurred in the process. the depiction of the good and generous King Cathair Mór as a golden tree dispensing mast throughout Ireland, as is explicitly explained in an allegorical vision which forms part of the Dindsenchas of Loch Gorman, this exemplifies the opposite dimension, the depiction of fruitful, landscapes in human terms. So trees are indeed like people, but for us this evening, they're emblematic in their many branches and girth of various ways of reading the environment in Dindsenchas Éideann. Ordering history, symbolising both the passage of time as well as Christian continuity, they provide important markers around which this complex compendium of knowledge about Ireland's notable places is formed. For all its imagination and creative energy, Dindsenchas Éideann depicts an environment revolving around a living landscape and natural features that had a basis in reality, or that were indeed real. And human interactions with the environment reflect engagement with physical surroundings that authors and audiences of the corpus would have recognised. So reading the environment in Dindsenchas Éideann involves an appreciation of both the structure and symbolism of this complex created construct, but also an understanding of the text's grounding in its own physical space and time. Returning to John Montague's poem, with which I commenced, many of you will know that it expresses a sense of loss at being unable to access past landscapes. The whole landscape, a manuscript we had lost the skill to read, a part of our past disinherited. The language shift to which Montague alludes as the underlying cause is, of course, colossal and fundamental, but with reference to medieval Ireland, however, elements of its multifaceted environment can still be read in Dindsenchas Éideann through an image-encrusted name. Thank you very much.
Máire, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that. As is custom for this lecture, there are no questions at the end of it, but we do invite you to the Talbot Hotel, formerly known as the Stillorgan Park Hotel, for those of you with that, just down the road on the Stillorgan dual carriageway here. So please join us for a drink and a celebration of this. And just to, again, what an amazing paper, Máire. Thank you so much. Thank you.